Good day, everyone. We are Group 2 and we will be reporting cross cultural business. Before everything
It's
else,
not professional and it's not ethical.
let's have an icebreaker. So, it's just about Philippine practices and customs as compared to other countries. For the first one, it's pointing directions with lips. Is it professional and is it ethical in Nicaragua? It is professional and it is ethical. In Nicaragua, people point with their lips rather than their fingers. It's a unique cultural gesture accompanied by head movements. Now, how about using your index finger to point at things and sometimes people? Is it professional and is it ethical in Malaysia? It's not professional and it's not ethical. Instead, people use their thumb to gesture. How about being late and considering it normal and just calling it Filipino time? Is it professional and is it ethical in Germany? It's not professional and it's not ethical. Germans value punctuality highly. Being even a few minutes late to a meeting can be seen as disrespectful and unprofessional. Our first topic is about national differences in political economy, and we open it with a case on Saudi Arabia's dynamic culture. Saudi Arabia's mixture of strict religious convictions, ancient social traditions, and governmental economic policies results in laws and customs that often contrast with those in other countries. They also shift with little advance notice and vary by industry and region. Although the land encompassing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has a long history, most of that history, invaders controlled a divided land and most inhabitants had a tribal rather than national loyalty. Nevertheless, the inhabitants have shared a common language, which is Arabic, and religion, which is Islam. King Saud, a descendant of Muhammad, took power in 1901. He also merged independent areas, created a political and religious entity, and legitimized his monarchy and succession by being the defender of Islamic holy areas, beliefs, and values. Now, Saudi's current government is a monarchy based on Islam, and their current king, Salman, serves as the head and commander in chief of the country's military. The growing importance of oil for Saudi Arabia, particularly in the 1970s, led to rapid urbanization. This gave the government the means to offer social services such as free education. These changes have furthered its citizens' sense of a national identity, while diminishing their traditional and particularly nomadic ways of living. Cities have modernized physically, however, below the physical surface, Saudis hold some attitudes and values that are neither like the norm elsewhere nor easily discerned. Modernization has been controversial within Saudi Arabia. There's a liberal group, supported by an elite foreign traveled segment. They want economic growth to provide more choices in products and lifestyles. On the other hand, there is a conservative group, supported by religious leaders, and is fearful that modernization will upset traditional values and strict Quranic teachings. The government, which is the royal family, must satisfy conservative viewpoints lest its leadership becomes vulnerable. Meanwhile, liberals have been largely pacified by taking well paid government jobs and slowly gaining the transformation they wish. The government has sometimes made trade offs to appease conflicting groups, such as requiring women to wear longer robes because women must wear abayas in exchange for advancing women's education. Moving on to religious factors, if you are accustomed to fairly strict separation between religion and the state, you will probably find the pervasiveness of religious culture in Saudi Arabia daunting. Many companies convert revenue generating space to prayer areas, and IKEA even erased pictures of women from its Saudi catalog. Rules of behavior may also be hard to comprehend because religious and legal rules have sometimes been adapted to contemporary situations. Islamic law, for instance, forbids charging interest and selling accident insurance because there's a strict doctrine which holds that there are no accidents, only preordained acts of God. Nor are expected behaviors necessarily the same for locals and foreigners. Non-Muslim foreign women are not required to wear headscarves, although they may be admonished by religious patrols. An example of this is that Saudi Arabian airlines do not hire Saudi women as flight attendants. They believe that being in direct contact with men might tempt promiscuous behavior. However, they hire women from other Arab nations. Moving on to traditional factors, there's an oft quoted saying, me against my brothers and me against my cousins, then my cousins and me against strangers. This illustrates a family centered society where trust of others is highly correlated with the degree of familiarity with them. Given the trust factor, most Saudi businesses have historically been family owned and operated, preferring to hire family members or people they know well, even though others might be better qualified technically. Saudi's preference for dealing with people they know has led to a system known as wasta, which roughly translates into English as connections. Thus, who you know helps a great deal in almost everything, such as moving a resume to the top of a pile. Not understanding this norm, a British publisher dispatched two salesmen to Saudi Arabia and paid them on commission. The salesmen moved aggressively to make the same number of calls and sales per day as they made in Britain, where they were used to punctual schedules, undivided attention of potential clients, and conversations devoted only to business. To the British salespeople, time was money. In Saudi Arabia, however, they found that appointments seldom began at the appointed time, usually taking place at cafes over cups of coffee because they generally prefer to get to know you well and develop a certain level of friendship before ever turning to business. But the British felt that Saudis spent too much time in idle chit chat while ignoring business to talk with friends. Eventually, both salesmen showed their irritation, and their Saudi counterparts regarded them as rude and impatient. Based largely on a Quranic prescription whereby daughters receive half the inheritance that sons receive, females are placed in a separate and often seemingly subservient position. Their role has been to be virtuous, marry young, and have offspring, while males take responsibility as their protectors and the family breadwinners. These beliefs had led to prohibitions for women, such as for traveling abroad with a male relative's permission and studying abroad without a male relative escort. Basically, men and women that are unrelated by blood may only meet personally in open areas, or in closed areas when the females are accompanied by a male relative. It is vital that businesses educate themselves accordingly. For instance, restaurants are considered closed areas, and proprietors must maintain separate dining rooms and entrances for men without female companions. However, the food malls at most shopping centers are considered open areas where members of both sexes intermingle. Men and women may mix in the workplace, but the situation is complex. Male and female employees within the public sector work in separate buildings, and although females now outnumber males as university graduates, only about 15% of the Saudi workforce is female. Some women prefer traditional family roles, some find driving restrictions to be too much of a hassle, and some families prohibit female members from working because of family honor, usually with the line, what will people think? Economic factors blend with cultural ones as well, such as companies' reluctance to hire women so as to avoid incurring the cost of providing separate entrances and toilet facilities. Nevertheless, the genders do interact in multinational companies as long as they adhere to dress code. However, females are limited in foreign business travel because they need permission from their male relatives. Some multinationals ease this problem by paying the travel costs for a male relative to accompany a woman abroad. At one time, visas for single women to enter Saudi Arabia were nearly unobtainable. While these visas are not given automatically, they can be obtained more easily for women over 40, but also possible for younger women, especially with the use of VASTA. However, several events foretell possible fewer future differences in gender requirements. Women can now vote and hold political office, and divorced women and widows can now manage their family affairs. To illustrate, one of the first acceptances of working women alongside men in Saudi was in the medical field. This is because of the shortage of doctors, the high cost to separate male and female specialists, and the compatibility of healing with women's role as nurturers. The Saudi business world has seen much change. Consider now that women own about 20% of all Saudi businesses. Bear in mind, however, that tend to be uneven, particularly among the country's geographic areas and among people with different income and educational levels. What we can take away from this is that for Saudi, the church and the state is not separate because their national identity and even their policy making, among many other things, are anchored on their religion. The integration of Islamic principles shapes business practices in ways that other countries are not used to. So it goes without saying that religious and cultural understanding must come first before one can achieve compliance with Saudi's laws and adaptation to their political environment. Saudi Arabia's dynamic culture offers a fascinating lens through which to examine the interplay between societal values and governance. Now we're ready to get more technical, starting off with a discussion on political systems. Let's start with the concept of democracy. Ever heard the line, "It's a free country, I can do whatever I want"? In democratic systems, individual rights are ideally prioritized. As such, citizens actively participate in choosing their leaders through elections, like what's happening now in the Philippines, where you can see several tarpaulins and campaign materials of senators and other government officials who are running for office. Also prioritized are the rule of law and transparent governance, creating an environment where freedoms are well protected. The United States is also a strong example of democracy. Its stable legal framework and robust protection of business rights make it an appealing place for entrepreneurship and investment. On the other hand, totalitarian regimes take a starkly different approach. Power is concentrated in the hands of one party or a single group, often restricting individual freedoms and maintaining centralized control over nearly all aspects of society. North Korea stands out as an example of totalitarianism, with the state exercising strict control over its citizens and businesses. The tightly regulated system offers little room for entrepreneurial activity or innovation as freedom is severely limited.
Now let's explore the different economic systems and how they shape national economies. First, we have the traditional economy, which is based on customs and traditions, and where decisions are made according to cultural practices passed down through generations. Examples include rural societies or indigenous communities where life revolves around time honored customs. Next, the market economy, which is driven by supply and demand with minimal government intervention. Countries like Hong Kong and Switzerland are prime examples where businesses and consumers shape the economy. Next, in a command economy, the government controls production, pricing, and distribution with limited private ownership. Examples include North Korea and the former Soviet Union, where the government runs most aspects of the economy. And finally, a mixed economy which blends market freedom with government regulation, balancing both public and private control. Countries like Canada, France, and Philippines follow this model where both sectors share control.
So, as we've seen with economic systems, countries actually organize their economies based on different approaches, whether it's capitalism, socialism, or a mixed system. However, the way a country enforces laws, resolves disputes, and manages property also significantly impacts their economic environment. And this is where legal systems come into play. Now there are different types of legal systems, beginning with common law. So this system is actually based on judicial decisions and precedents. So what does this mean? So this just means that judges have a significant role in interpreting and applying the law. So the US and the UK are actually prime examples of where courts rely on past rulings to guide current decisions. So this type of legal system actually provides flexibility and adaptability in legal interpretations, which is beneficial for business and market regulation. Next up, we have civil law, which is based on written codes and statutes. So, in here, legal decisions are strictly guided by written laws. So, countries like Germany or France actually use this type of system, and this ensures that the law is clear and systematic, providing more predictability in legal outcomes. The third system that we have is religious law, wherein laws are derived from religious teachings or beliefs. So, countries like Saudi Arabia have a legal system that is influenced by Sharia law as well as Iran. So, this system is actually integral to how business, family matters, and even daily life are governed, and they often have a strong focus on moral and ethical principles dictated by religious doctrines. Lastly, we also have the customary law, which is based on traditions and customs that evolve over time. So many African countries actually use this, as well as indigenous communities. And this is where local traditions and customs serve as key to resolving disputes and guiding societal norms. So, this type of system actually reflects the cultural values of a place and puts focus on community based decision making. So, why is studying legal systems important? Well, the legal environment of a country can either attract or discourage foreign investment. So, countries with clear and transparent legal frameworks actually encourage global trade and investment into their country, while those with weaker or less predictable legal systems may actually deter economic activity. Ultimately, the legal systems serve as the backbone of a nation's political and economic structure. And all in all, national differences in political economy, shaped by legal systems, economic structures, and political governance, have a profound impact on a country's economic performance, social equity, and global competitiveness. So, these differences actually influence everything from business operations and foreign investment to social policies and governance. These national differences also connect closely with cultural differences, which we are going to study next, as cultural values often influence legal principles and economic policies. Understanding both political and legal systems, along with their cultural context, is actually key to understanding global economic and business dynamics.
Before looking at the differences in culture of the many countries, we must first understand why culture is an important consideration in international business. Imagine being assigned to a foreign territory that you know almost nothing about. It is safe to assume that you would have to navigate not only business matters and numbers, but also values, traditions, and unwritten social rules, all of which have to do with the nation's culture. We first look at national cultures as a point of reference. We have core values which are so strong that they are not negotiable, peripheral values that are less dominant and more pliable, and then culture, which is the shared values, attitudes, and beliefs of a group of individuals. The nation provides a workable definition of culture because similarity among people is both a cause and effect of national boundaries. Within a nation's borders, people chiefly share such essential attributes as values and language. The feeling of we casts foreigners as they. At the same time, some people, and probably a growing number, are bicultural or multicultural, meaning that they have internalized more than one national culture because of having dual or multiple citizenships. Groups can hold more similar attitudes with like groups abroad than with dissimilar groups in their own countries. For instance, urban people in country A may have more in common with urban people in country B than with rural people in their own country. As a consequence, when comparing nations culturally, one must be careful to examine relevant groups, differentiating between, say, the typical attitudes of rural and urban dwellers, or between managers and production workers. Looking at people factor, as nationalities come together through projects and teams, their diverse perspectives and experiences often enable businesses to gain a deeper knowledge of how to create and deliver products and services. However, successful cultivation of diversity is difficult because individuals may interact as they do within their own cultures. For instance, problems occur when some nationalities are accustomed to compete with team members, while others are accustomed to cooperate. Similarly, language differences inhibit a common understanding of team roles, priorities, and sentiments. The more successful teams work to understand each other's cultures before dealing with the tasks at hand. When there is an expectation of diversity, team members must realize the need to prepare to deal with differences, keep open minds, and develop a non threatening atmosphere, especially for dealing with others who may feel insecure in the language or threatened when expressing minority and divergent viewpoints. When contact among divergent cultures creates problems, the situation is known as cultural collision. Our opening case about the British salespeople going to Saudi illustrates both problems. Specifically, the British sales reps came from a deal focused culture where people are primarily task oriented, whereas the Saudis came from a relationship focused culture. DF people typically view RF people as time wasters, whereas RF people view DF people as offensively blunt. Thus, to build cultural awareness, when a company moves into international markets, it first needs to figure out what's different between the foreign business practices at its own, and then decide whether or not adjustments are necessary. It's not always straightforward because people tend to approach situations based on what would make sense in their own country. But there's no perfect blueprint for understanding another culture. What counts as core cultural values or minor quirks can vary. Moreover, some people naturally know how to navigate cultural norms and avoid stepping on toes, while others might unintentionally offend or appear unaware. To add to the complexity, even when you research another culture, you have to be careful. Information can sometimes rely on outdated stereotypes, focus on just one part of the country, or be completely irrelevant today. But of course, cultural variations are too numerous to memorize completely. However, what might seem like a small misstep to you could be seen as rude or ignorant by someone else, putting your business dealings at risk. Hence, we still need to be thoughtful, open, and prepared when dealing with new cultural environments as much as possible. Let's consider one example: the many different ways to address people. Should you use a given name or a surname? Does a surname come before or after a given name? Japan, for example, valued the use of honorifics as a sign of respect, and the corporate context in their country provide different terms for different positions in the company. We now look at challenges in cultural assessments. Too often, when we can't explain some difference, say why the Irish consume more cold cereal than the Spanish do, we attribute it to culture without probing why. Perhaps the difference is simply that cereal companies have marketed more in Ireland. Entrepreneurial practices, for example, could be influenced not only by risk taking values, but also by current economic conditions. China's changing preference for male versus female offspring offers an example of cultural and economic interaction. When China had its one child policy, millions of families aborted female fetuses and put girls up for adoption. Why? Because males could carry on a family name, which is cultural. They could also help work fields in rural areas, an economic factor, and care for parents in old age, combining cultural and economic considerations. Recently, however, China has seen a shift toward preference for female offsprings. Why? Urbanization requires fewer male workers on farms, an economic consideration, while raising property values, another economic consideration, have taken a toll on families' tradition of buying living quarters for sons before they can marry, a cultural consideration. As such, when we interpret cultural research, comparing countries by what people say can be risky. Some groups may be happiest when they're complaining, while some respond with what they think questioners want to hear. Researchers focusing on national differences in terms of averages may overlook variations within countries. Personality differences make some people outliers in their own countries, with no certainty that they'll eventually integrate and conform to their national norms. When most people are close to their country's average, it is known as cultural tightness. When people are not, it is known as cultural looseness. Lastly, societies are dynamic. Social norms, values, and behaviors change for several reasons over time. For businesses operating globally, this means that relying on outdated cultural research can lead to ineffective strategies and misjudgments.
Culture shapes who we are from an early age. It influences our traditions, language, beliefs, and even our daily habits. But have you ever wondered how culture changes? What factors lead to the transformation of traditions that have been passed down for generations? Today, we'll explore the various influences on cultural formation and change. So now we move on to influences on cultural formation and change. So we know that culture is developed at an early age, but how is it exactly changed? Well, we see that there's two sources of change. First is change by choice, where people are presented with new alternatives. So these new alternatives are usually social and economic situations. For an example, when rural people accept factory jobs, they change basic customs. They have less social interactions. Why? Since their previous work, which is farm work, has more standardized hours than regular work. So this results in a change of culture, though a change by choice. Another example is urban migration, where younger people embrace a more individualistic lifestyle, which also changes their culture. Second is change by imposition, where people impose certain elements from an alien or outside culture. This is also called cultural imperialism, where it is a forced change from the laws by a dominant country. So these laws could include access to foreign travel and information which they get from abroad, which has an effect on their culture by imposition. Some countries also have a desire to adopt foreign practices or have new technology, which can also contribute to cultural change. And contact among countries brings change, which is called cultural diffusion. So, this mixing of cultures, if happens, means it's become a creolization. So, for an example, South Korea had become more multi ethnic because of the influx of foreigners, which they needed to work in their factories for their technological knowledge. But to help contradict this, the government sponsored programs and language centers to hopefully Koreanize the foreigners or make them more Korean or adjusted to their culture. Another example would be Western fashion and media through the popularity of Hollywood movies in the 20th century, and the rate at which they were shared in that century was really great, meaning Western culture was also shared at that high speed fashion. So, language can be both a diffuser and stabilizer of culture. Firstly, as a stabilizer, it limits contact among people who can communicate the language and also becomes the heart of social identity. So, imagine a scenario where you and your siblings were able to create a secret language amongst yourselves. Then, you could only communicate to yourselves with this language in a secret fashion. And it brings upon a social bond, which also creates a social culture between you and your siblings because of this secret language. Now, language as a diffuser. A group with a unique language tends to learn the language of others to not be isolated. So, in the scenario before, if you only knew the secret language of your siblings, after some time, you would have to learn a different language so that you could be adjusted into a bigger society. So, because of this, in the world, English became the top tier lingua franca or the common language. So now it is deemed the current language of business. So it is also used by non English speaking countries to train their citizens to be outsourced. But this may not maintain, as with Latin or French as previous lingua franca, emerging economies such as India or China may dictate the future global lingua franca. So here's a map of the world's major languages. You can see there's a lot of purple there in the North America and also Australia, and also even some parts of Africa. You can also see a bit of green to Africa and then blue in China. So basically, there's a lot of major languages in the world. And right now, with English is the lingua franca, but that may change. But interestingly, there's China and South Korea, but there's not a Japan or an India. So I'm not sure with this map. It is from the book. Anyways, let's move on. So now, religion as a cultural stabilizer. Religious influence can majorly shape cultural values, even in countries where religious influence is declining. So this is actually even stronger among countries with strong religious convictions. And religion can have influenced beliefs that affect business. First example is McDonald's, where they limited beef and pork in India for Hindus and Muslims. And second, in Islamic finance, they prohibit interest based transactions under Sharia law, which led to Islamic banking that catered to Muslim communities. So, although companies can change their product offerings in different countries, it is still important not to generalize, especially with multinational enterprises, which can have multiple companies in different countries. And lastly, religious wars or violence can also affect lives, not only in the country, but also internationally. So, with the advent of the internet, information is being spread around faster. So, countries should take note with companies who supported them in the past and are supporting with them now. Since with a company support for a certain country, they may be boycotted or cancelled online. So companies should take note of the country in which they're supporting in. So here is a map of the world's religions, and we can see that Christian people are the highest number in millions, followed by other religions. So companies should take note of the majority of religions in their country in which they are in, but also still take note of the other religions as well. Now let's move on to the next part.
Different countries have distinct ways of thinking and interacting that shape their business practices. In international business, understanding these behavioral differences is crucial as they help people navigate cross cultural business and interactions. Today, we're also going to explore some of the major behavioral factors that influence business across cultures, starting with social stratification. So, every culture actually ranks people, and this process of ranking individuals in a hierarchy is called social stratification. So, this can be determined through either meritocracy or group memberships. So, let's look at these two more closely. First off, we have meritocracy, which in most business cultures is a highly valued principle. So, ranking through meritocracy actually means that individuals and organizations are recognized based on their abilities, achievements, and qualifications rather than on factors such as social status or connections. So, this system actually drives people to work hard and prove themselves, which is particularly important in competitive business environment because it places emphasis on competition and individual achievement or merit. This can be seen in the different examples below, such as choosing a known celebrity to promote a brand, which most brands actually do. So, businesses choose a celebrity to represent their brand by evaluating their fame, success, and other types of achievements, and the most ideal candidates are those who rank high on these criteria. Singapore also has a meritocratic education and public sector built on the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, can succeed if they work hard and demonstrate their abilities. South Korea's competitive society also banks on this principle, which can be seen especially in cases like their national exams for college, which is an important determinant in a person's future. And of course, the same principle and system can be seen in our country, especially in job hunting. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with the potato corner hiring fiasco that caused a stir on social media. So, however extreme this example may be, this just shows how meritocracy is valued very deeply in many societies. However, this is also not always the case. In some societies, actually, people value and rank people based on group affiliations or memberships, and this can either be through ascribed or acquired memberships. So when we say ascribed, these are those that are determined by birth, like age, family, ethnicity, and the likes. Acquired group memberships, on the other hand, are those based on religion, political affiliation, educational place and achievement, as well as profession. So societies actually value group affiliations differently, which also causes differences in business practices among countries. For instance, in Japan, seniority is deeply valued. In the case of the British and Germany companies, we can see how staff reduction is affected by two different principles, wherein British people operate on a more meritocratic system, while the German people actually put emphasis on membership by age. Laws and policies often try to remove or reinforce group difference, and we can see it in the examples here, wherein in Africa, there is actually a policy that excludes female access to education, which in turn reinforces their lower earning potential. In contrast, in Europe, however, policies that actually attempt to remove group difference and overcome male dominance in the workforce are in place by setting work quotas or hiring requirements for female employment. Country by country attitudes also vary towards social connections, race and ethnicity, male and female roles, rules and expectations based on age, as well as family ties, which we have seen earlier. Now we will explore a lot of these more closely. So, as we all know, one large factor that can influence opportunities is ethnicity or racial groups. In Malaysia, they define political parties and employment quotas explicitly by three ethnic groups, which are the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians. And in Brazil, they also have racial quotas in universities and in some workplaces as well. So these types of policies actually are often crafted to reduce and address racial inequality in countries. Next up, we have gender based groups wherein differences, inequality, and attitudes towards gender actually also affect opportunities. And these are quite pronounced in many countries, just like how we saw in the Saudi Arabian case earlier. In many places, however, gender barriers in employment practices are coming down because of changes in attitude and work requirements, such as in the US, where a noticeable change is reflected in the number of male nurses and female physicians increasing, when in the past it was dominated by the opposite sex. But we must also keep in mind that some of these changes may be economic rather than attitudinal, as people may have simply gravitated towards the fields of work wherein jobs are highly available. Age is also an important factor, and all countries actually enforce age related laws such as unemployment, driving privileges, and civic duty. But sometimes, the logic of these laws seems paradoxical. For instance, the US allows citizens to vote, marry, drive, and die for their country before they can legally buy alcohol at 21. National differences towards employment age are also substantial. For example, both Finland and the Netherlands enforce mandatory retirement ages, and in Britain, age discrimination laws apply to all ages, whereas US law protects only people over the age of 40. By examining these types of things, we can actually see the cultural perspective of countries in different aspects of life. In addition to those mentioned, family based groups are also of importance, and in some cultures, actually, family is considered as the most important group. In cultures like this, a person's position in society depends heavily on their family's social status or respectability rather than on individual achievement. When family ties are strong, small family run companies are also quite successful, as we have seen in the Chibos of South Korea. In Italy, success is also tied to family, and in the Middle East, family also comes into play in securing deals and even positions in the government. There is a caveat to this, however, because when family is highly regarded in a culture, they often encounter growth difficulties because owners are reluctant to share responsibility with competent individuals hired outside from the family. When its business culture is hampered, a country may lack sufficient numbers of indigenously owned large scale companies that are usually necessary for long term economic development. Now, let's talk about work motivation. What motivates people to work hard and how this varies culturally. So, as we know, motivation is tied to productivity, and higher worker productivity means higher company efficiency and higher economic development for countries. Now, one big factor for this can be materialism or the desire for material wealth. Over a century ago, sociologist Max Weber noted that predominantly Protestant countries were very economically developed, and he linked this to the Protestant work ethic, wherein hard work and prosperity were seen as signs of virtue. So, although we no longer strictly accept this distinction, we do tend to adhere to some of its underlying notions such as that self discipline, hard work, honesty, and a belief in a just word foster work motivation and thus economic growth. Money, however, isn't the only motivator. Some are also motivated by religious beliefs. Now, this one can go both ways, depending on the belief. It could either motivate a person or demotivate them. For instance, predetermination can lessen motivation because of the will be notion. Moreover, in societies such as Bhutan and Myanmar, religious practices can actually pull people away from work. Think of extended religious holidays or traditions of taking time for prayer, affecting how many people are willing to put in the hours or even work completely. Another aspect of motivation is the work life balance ideal, where in some societies, literally work to live and others live to work. For instance, France works to live, and they require actually about 30 days of paid vacation by law, reflecting a cultural value on leisure and quality life, whereas the US has no mandated paid vacation days, reflecting a culture that prioritizes work. Additionally, the perceived likelihood of success and its rewards against failure also influence work motivation. Research and experience show that people are most motivated when rewards for success are high relative to failure, and there is some uncertainty when it comes to attaining that success. When success actually seems too easy or impossible to achieve, it is found that it decreases motivation. Additionally, in cultures where the probability of economic failure is almost certain, people tend to view work as unsatisfying, mainly because they foresee little benefit to themselves. There's also less motivation found to work hard, wherein public policy allocates output from productive workers to unproductive ones. Now, when it comes to performance and achievements, some theories and models also help determine work motivation, such as the masculinity and femininity index. So, this is a measure actually towards achievement, as high masculinity shows a preference for live to work, and high femininity shows a preference for work to live. This index can actually explain national differences in behaviors and help address issues when workers belonging to opposite sides of the index are combined, causing a conflict in behavior and decrease in worker motivation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs also serves as a helpful tool. As we all know, according to this theory, people try to fulfill lower level needs before moving on to higher level ones. Now, this helps in distinguishing among employees' reward preferences in different parts of the work. In very poor countries, for example, a company may motivate majority of its workers by simply providing enough monetary compensation to satisfy needs for food and shelter. Elsewhere, a larger portion of workers may be motivated by other levels of needs. However, we must keep in mind that compensation, even at low levels of income, cannot fully explain differences in work motivation. There are also other factors that come into play because workers sometimes prioritize other levels of needs, such as maintaining relationships and addressing social belonging. And this brings us to our next part, which is relationship preferences. So let's explore this further, as these preferences differ a lot around the world and can make or break workplace harmony. One major element of relationship preferences is power distance, or how people prefer the degree of interaction between superiors and subordinates are. High power distance actually limits consultation between bosses and subordinates and promotes a more autocratic or paternalistic management style, while lower power distance prefers the opposite. Now, this is important because people perform better when these interactions fit their preferences. Clearly, worker participation methods may need to be adjusted to fit different countries, as placing people with opposing beliefs can actually deteriorate performance. Another vital relationship preference is individualism versus collectivism. So, this is about whether people see themselves more as independent actors or as part of a tight knit group. In individualistic cultures, employees often value autonomy, individual achievement, and direct monetary rewards, and the self actualization opportunity is actually a prime motivator because employees want challenges to improve themselves. For cultures with high collectivism, however, there is emphasis on group harmony, loyalty, and dependence on the organization or team, and fulfilling security needs is a prime motivator, such as in Japan. Different cultures also have different appetites for risk and uncertainty in business. Some play it safe, while others are more adventurous. We'll examine a few dimensions of this, starting with uncertainty avoidance. So, this concept actually refers to the trait of being uncomfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty. In cultures with high uncertainty avoidance, ambiguity makes people feel very uneasy, so they crave rules, plans, and stability. They also tend to stay with their current employers for a long time as they prefer the certainty of present positions over uncertainty of their future elsewhere, which again, Japan is a textbook example of. Next up is trust. Now, when this is high, business costs actually tend to be lower as managers spend less time fussing over every other possible contingency or non compliance, increasing their productivity and efficiency. It is also worth noting that trust may differ between people in the in group and others. In family oriented businesses and societies, people have high trust of their family but low trust of people outside their family circle. Now, moving on to future orientation, which is essentially how much people delay gratification and plan for the long run. So, this trait also varies. Some cultures are very long term oriented, while others prefer to live more in the moment. So, when future orientation is strong, people are willing to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow. If more pronounced, motivation can be done through delayed compensation programs such as retirement plans. So, Switzerland is actually an example of a future oriented society with norms of saving and meticulous long term planning, whereas Italy has been noted as less so, with more emphasis on enjoying the present. Lastly, we have fatalism. So, fatalism just refers to the belief that outcomes are preordained or beyond one's control. So, this is the notion of the what will be, will be. If a culture has a strong fatalistic streak, individuals may feel that personal effort doesn't change fate. Mexico is often cited as having a cultural tendency towards this concept, perhaps influenced by their history and religious outlooks. So, in a workplace, fatalistic employees might not respond to the usual motivational rhetoric about hard work pays off because they aren't convinced that it will make a difference. Managers in such cultures learn that appeals need to be more personal or tied to immediate benefits. And now, the last big factor under this section is how cultures process information and approach tasks, which affects communication, decision making, and day to day work style. The first subtopic under this is perception of cue. So, research says that we humans are selective in perceiving cues, which are influenced either by our genetics or our language. In genetics, for instance, eye pigmentation in people causes some to differentiate colors more precisely than others. On the topic of language, the richness of a language descriptive vocabulary allows its speaker to note and express very subtle nuances that non speakers might not be able to discern. For example, the Arabic language has more words for camels and other parts of working with it than any other language in the world. The Inuit language also has many words for this concept of snow, and different languages around the world have certain concepts to show respect, like how South Korea has different degrees of formality in their language, or how we Filipinos have the concept of po and opo. Now, being aware of these perceptual differences is important and means that we should listen and observe more carefully when inside a new culture, as we might literally not be seeing what they see. It helps to ask locals and other colleagues living there what factors they consider when making a decision to catch those different cues and avoid conflicts and misunderstanding. Next, obtaining information actually also varies across cultures, with some being low context and others high context. For low context cultures, people prefer direct and explicit communication with little time spent on small talk, while high context cultures communicate in a more roundabout or implicit way, relying on shared understanding, nonverbal cues, and reading between the lines. All cultures also process information differently in as much as they categorize, plan, and quantify. Every culture has its own systems for ordering and classifying information, and to perform efficiently and work amicably in a foreign environment, one needs to understand such differences. Further, different processing systems also create challenges in sharing global data, such as in the example below, wherein US directories sort names in alphabetical order by using the person's last names, while Iceland actually uses people's first names. In information processing, monochronic and polychronic cultures also come into play. In monochronic cultures, people normally prefer to work sequentially, while in polychronic ones, multitasking is the norm. So, this is important as combining people from both can cause misunderstandings, such as people in monochronic cultures can actually feel that they are being dismissed or not valued when interacting with a person from a polychronic culture who prefers to work on different tasks simultaneously because they don't have their undivided attention. And lastly, for this section, we have the concept of idealism and pragmatism. So, some cultures tend to focus first on the whole and then on the parts, while others do the opposite. Now, this is also important because it can affect everything from how problems are solved and how business deals are negotiated. And as such, it also needs to be studied and threaded carefully. Now, as we have seen, cultural behavioral factors profoundly influence how business is done. And in international business, it's all about bridging gaps. Understanding culture doesn't mean stereotyping or assuming everyone from a country is the same, but it gives us a starting framework. Getting to know the individuals we work with and using these insights as guideposts can tremendously help one navigate cross cultural business interactions with confidence.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you said something, but the other person understood it differently? Or maybe you've traveled to another country and realized that common gestures or words mean something entirely different. These moments highlight the challenges of cross cultural communication. In this part of the presentation, we will explore the key problems people face when communicating across cultures, because in reality, cross cultural communication can be quite tricky. In fact, even when two people speak the same language, differences in meaning, gestures, or even the way they perceive time can lead to misunderstandings. Now, let's take a closer look at some key challenges in communicating across cultures and real life examples of how businesses have faced these hurdles. One of the biggest challenges in global communication is translation. Even simple words or phrases don't always carry the same meaning across different languages. First, there are words with no direct translation. Some languages have words that simply don't exist in another. For example, in Spanish, niños means young people in general, while hijos refers specifically to a parent's children. English, however, uses the word children for both contexts. Closer to home, Filipinos ourselves have the word kilig, a feeling of romantic excitement that has no exact English equivalent. While words like thrill or butterflies in the stomach come close, they don't fully capture the unique giddy sensation that kilig conveys. Next, when translations go wrong. Mistranslations can be embarrassing or even disastrous. Microsoft once released a Spanish thesaurus that contained offensive words, leading to miscommunication that alienated potential customers. Another famous case was when Pepsi launched its Come Alive, You're the Pepsi Generation campaign to capture the excitement, energy, and youthfulness associated with drinking Pepsi. However, when the brand expanded into the Chinese market, the translation of this slogan led to an unexpected and culturally inappropriate meaning. Instead of conveying a lively and refreshing experience, the translated slogan in Chinese reportedly came across as Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. Another thing to take note of is that grammar can either make or break a message. Even minor grammar mistakes can change the meaning of a sentence completely. Consider these real life errors found in international settings. In a hotel in Japan, a sign read, "You are invited to take advantage of the chambermaid." Clearly, the intention was to say that housekeeping services were available, but the phrasing created an entirely different, inappropriate meaning. Another example is how a cocktail lounge somewhere in Norway had a sign that said, "Ladies are requested not to have children in the bar." The actual meaning was that children were not allowed inside the bar, but the phrasing made it sound like an odd rule about pregnancy. These examples highlight how even small mistakes in translation or sentence structure can lead to confusion, or worse, unintentional offense. Communication isn't just about words. Gestures, body language, and even colors can convey different meanings in different cultures. Another key challenge arises when these nonverbal cues are misinterpreted, leading to confusion or even offense. What might be considered harmless in one country may have completely different connotations elsewhere. Starting off with body language or when gestures don't mean the same thing. Here, it is important to bear in mind that body language is not a universal language. A simple hand gesture can mean one thing in one country and something offensive in another. Take, for example, the OK sign, where the thumb and index finger form a circle, may indicate a positive thing in the US, but in countries like Germany, Greece, and France, this same gesture may come across as offensive. This highlights the importance of being aware of how gestures can be interpreted differently across cultures, as the line between approval and insult can be surprisingly thin. Another example is how nodding your head up and down usually means yes in many cultures, but in Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, it actually means no. It's a real life example of the lyrics from a famous song that goes, "What do you mean when you nod your head yes, but you wanna say no?" A mix up that could lead to serious confusion in a business meeting. Second is, Colors have meanings, and it is not just about aesthetics. We must recognize that colors carry cultural significance as well. In business, color choices can influence branding, marketing, and customer perception. A color that symbolizes luck in one culture may represent a totally different concept in another. In most Western cultures, black is the color of death and mourning. But in some parts of Africa and Asia, white is worn at funerals. A famous business case in relation to this was when United Airlines made a costly mistake when they handed out white carnations to customers in Hong Kong, unaware that in Chinese culture, white flowers symbolize death. What was meant to be a welcoming gesture ended up making customers uncomfortable. Moving on to the concept of personal space. But how close is too close? Well, it depends on where you live and it depends on where you are. Researchers have explored why people have different perceptions of personal space, and they found that several factors influence it, like temperature, gender, and age. Interestingly, cultures around the world can be grouped into two categories: contact cultures and non contact cultures. Contact cultures, which include countries in South America, the Middle East, and Southern Europe, are more comfortable with physical closeness and casual touching during conversations. Meanwhile, non contact cultures, like those in Northern Europe, North America, and Asia, tend to prefer more physical distance and less touch in social interactions. As Professor Catherine Sorrells puts it, cultural space tells us a lot about relationships. If someone stands too close, closer than what we're used to, it might make us uncomfortable even if they don't mean any harm. This shows why it's important to understand different cultural norms, especially in business settings, where personal space and physical interactions can influence trust and communication. Beyond physical space, another key cultural difference lies in how people perceive time and punctuality. While some cultures view time as rigid and structured, others see it as fluid and flexible. But is time really a scarce resource, or is time an event? To better understand this, here are some examples. In countries like the US and Germany, time is treated as a limited resource. Punctuality is highly valued and efficiency is a priority. Being late is often considered unprofessional. In contrast, in Latin America and the Middle East, time is seen as more flexible. Meetings may extend beyond their scheduled time, and relationship building is often prioritized over strict deadlines. To illustrate this difference, consider a US business team that is trying to secure a contract in Mexico where they scheduled only one meeting to discuss everything at once. Meanwhile, a French team set aside 2 weeks for negotiations, taking time to build trust with the Mexican partners. Can you guess who won the contract? In the end, the French team won the deal by adapting to the local culture's flexible view of time, where indeed, timing is everything. Similarly, in the Philippines, the concept of Filipino time, where people arrive late in social gatherings, is widely accepted. However, this cultural norm can be quite costly as it may create challenges in business, especially when working with international partners who expect strict punctuality. Shifting from time perception, another crucial aspect of cross cultural communication is how different societies express status and respect in professional settings. In the US, prestige is often associated with material symbols, such as a corner office, a high salary, or executive perks. Meanwhile, in Asian and Middle Eastern cultures, status is tied to hierarchy and formal titles. Again, in American workplaces, employees commonly address their bosses by first names. However, in many Asian cultures, this level of informality is considered inappropriate. For example, if a US executive casually calls a Japanese CEO by their first name, Tanaka, instead of adding an honorific Tanaka-san, it can be perceived as disrespectful, which might unintentionally harm the business relationship. Given these diverse cultural norms, how can businesses ensure effective and respectful communication across cultures? Here are some strategies that can help. First, in improving translations, make use of back translation. Translate a message into another language, then have a different person translate it back to the original language. Have a person go from, say, English to French, and second from French back to English. If the meaning remains intact, the translation is likely accurate. Next, Avoid slang and idioms that may not translate well. Phrases like ballpark figure or out in left field may confuse non native speakers. It is best to use simple and straightforward language whenever possible. And of course, repeat and clarify key points when necessary to ensure that all parties are on the same page. In terms of navigating silent language differences, it is recommended that you research gestures or nonverbal cues before interacting with people from different cultures. Also, be mindful of personal space norms and adjust accordingly. Next, consider color meanings when branding and marketing internationally, as colors hold different meanings worldwide. Last but not the least, be culturally aware in business. Learn about status markers as titles may carry more significance than job roles in some cultures. In negotiations, focus on relationship building. In some cultures, trust is built through personal interactions rather than formal contracts. Rushing negotiations may harm business prospects. And lastly, be cautious with humor. What's funny in one culture may be offensive in another. When in doubt, keep humor professional and neutral. By understanding cultural differences in language, body language, cultural perception, and social norms, we can communicate more effectively, avoid misunderstandings, and build stronger global connections. Because at the end of the day, communication isn't just about what we say, but also about how others interpret it.
Culture shapes success, and how a company or individual adapts can make or break an international venture. From hidden cultural attitudes to shocking local customs, understanding the challenges of global adjustment is key to thriving in a foreign market. And that leads us to the four issues that affect degrees of successful adjustment. First, we have the host society acceptance. Minimal adaptation is needed when a product, technology, or operation aligns with the host country's core values. However, societal norms may still affect how foreigners are treated compared to locals, which can impact how businesses or individuals are accepted. For example, in Saudi Arabia, Western female flight attendants are allowed to wear clothing that is not permitted for local women, demonstrating the cultural differences in societal expectations. Next, we have the degree of cultural differences. This shows that similarity doesn't always mean easy business. Cultural distance measures how far apart countries are on key dimensions like religion, language, and economic development. Even countries with similar cultures may resist foreign practices if they feel threatened. For example, while France and the USA are culturally similar, France wasn't receptive to Disney due to concerns about American influence. The French saw Mickey Mouse as a comic conniver, found Disney souvenirs tacky, and disliked the strict dress codes and forced smiling, viewing them as undignified. In contrast, Disney found more success in Japan because their values of harmony and order aligned with Disney's focus on cleanliness and friendly service. They also saw Mickey Mouse as harmless and wholesome. Next, the ability to adjust. When moving abroad, individuals or employees might face culture shock, the frustration of adjusting to new cultural cues and expectations. Even simple tasks like using a different toilet can be challenging. At first, everything might seem exciting, but soon culture shock sets in, leading to confusion and frustration. Over time, after around a month or two, this fades as people become more comfortable. Some individuals even experience reverse culture shock when returning home, missing aspects of life abroad that aren't available back home. Next, we have company and management orientation. How a company adapts abroad depends not just on the host country's culture, but also on their own attitudes. There are three key orientations: polycentrism, ethnocentrism, and geocentrism. With polycentrism, companies operate like local businesses. For example, McDonald's in India offers the Makalu Tiki burger to suit local tastes, but too much adaptation can stifle innovation. Ethnocentrism, on the other hand, is believing home country practices are superior. For example, Walmart failed in Germany because they assumed US strategies would work, not accounting for cultural differences in shopping preferences. And finally, geocentrism blends home and host country practices with new innovations. For example, Saks Fifth Avenue adapted to Saudi Arabia by creating women only floors while keeping their home country merchandising style, blending local and home country strategies for success. Change can spark either innovation or resistance. The key is knowing when to adapt and who to involve. So, how can a business successfully implement change? Let's find out by taking a closer look at the strategies for instituting change. First, we have value systems. Core values are deeply ingrained, and if a practice contradicts them, it's unlikely to be accepted. Even changes to peripheral values can face resistance. Take Eritrea's low seafood consumption, for example. Despite its long coastline and food shortages, seafood is rarely eaten due to religious taboos among Cushitic speakers and a lack of refrigeration, among others. Next, resistance to too much change. Change is inevitable, but sudden drastic shifts can do more harm than good. For example, McCall's magazine made drastic changes, new editors, shorter stories, and stricter ad policies. This led to employee turnover, advertiser backlash, and lost revenue. Another example is Coca Cola replacing its classic formula with the new Coke in 1985. Customers rejected it, forcing the company to bring the original back. Next, participation. Participation reduces resistance, fosters awareness, and ensures smoother implementation. For example, Google gathers employee feedback through surveys to improve managerial effectiveness. This helps employees feel heard and valued. Another example is IKEA's Co-Create IKEA platform, which allows customers to contribute ideas for product development. This strengthens customer loyalty and improves innovation. Next, reward sharing. People resist change when they see no personal benefit, but sharing rewards can turn resistance into cooperation. For example, China National Petroleum faced backlash because local farmers saw no benefits from nearby drilling. In contrast, a US Peruvian gold mining venture gained local support by donating ship to Andean villagers, providing a clear benefit. Next, opinion leadership. Change is easier to accept when endorsed by trusted individuals. For example, Ford eased change in a Mexican plant by sending workers rather than supervisors to observe US operations. Peer trust made the shift smoother, and the same idea applies to using influencers to promote products. Bicultural individuals also help bridge cultural gaps. Their technical skills, cultural understanding, and flexibility make them more credible mediators. In Emily in Paris, Emily's American background and cultural adaptability help her succeed at work by navigating client relationships and by connecting with people from different backgrounds. Timing matters too. Even well planned changes can fail if poorly timed. For example, the pandemic forced companies to adopt remote work quickly. While it was gaining traction before, the timing of the crisis accelerated its widespread adoption, showing how timing can fast track previously resisted changes. And finally, learning abroad. International experience provides valuable insights for home markets. In Grey's Anatomy, doctors adopt international techniques to improve patient care. Just like Renault and Nissan, strengthen financial management and teamwork through shared expertise.
Ever said something in another language and got a weird look? Welcome to Lost in Translation, where words don't always mean what you think they do. Yes, yes, yes. Time for another icebreaker, where we can test how well you can guess tricky translations. Here's how it works. We'll show you one word per round. You'll get three choices, and all you have to do is pick the correct translation. Are you ready? For the first round, we have the word gift. In English, gift usually means a present. But what does it mean in Germany? A. Is it also called present? B. A lucky charm? Or C. Poison? For a sample situation, we have an English speaker saying, "Hi, I brought you a special gift from the US." Where a German speaker responds, "What? Why would you give me that?" The correct answer is C. Poison. In German, gift means poison, so be careful with the use of this word. Next up, we have the word embarazada. What does this word mean in Spanish? A. Embarrassed, B. Pregnant, or C. Nervous. For a sample situation, we have an English speaker saying, "Oh no, estoy embarazada," where a Spanish speaker answers, "Wait, really? That's good news. Felicidades." The correct answer is B. Pregnant. Embarazada may sound like embarrassed in English, but it actually means pregnant in Spanish. For the third round, the word is preservative. Now, what does this word mean? A. A food additive. B. A type of wine. Or C. A condom. For a sample situation, we have an English speaker saying, "Excuse me, does this food contain preservatives?" Where a French waiter replies, Pardon?" The correct answer is C. A condom. In English, preservative refers to food additives, but in French, préservatif means condom, so always be careful in French restaurants. Lost in translation moments happen more often than you think. Have you ever had a lost in translation moment? Share it in the comments.
We now move on to our last agenda, ethics in international business. To start our discussion on the topic, let's first define ethics. Taken from Merriam-Webster, it is a set of moral principles. Basically, it's about figuring out what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, and then choosing to do the right thing. It's like your inner compass for making fair and responsible choices. Now, why does ethics matter in international business? Well, the greater the distance from one's home country, the more complicated it is to do business. And more than distance measured in kilometers or whatnot, it is cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic. Given the criticisms of globalization and the challenge of companies and individuals doing business in areas of the world that are quite distant, how can companies and individuals be successful, or at least not create serious mistakes? First, a company must identify and satisfy different groups of stakeholders, which includes, but is not limited to, shareholders, employees, customers, suppliers, and society at large. Obviously, this juggling act can be tricky. The shareholder or stockholder versus stakeholder dilemma pits the demands of one stakeholder against all the others. In the short term, for example, group aims often conflict. Shareholders want additional sales and increased productivity, which will then result in higher profits and returns. Employees, on the other hand, want safer workplaces and higher compensation. Customers want higher quality products at lower prices. Society would like to see more jobs, more corporate support for social services, and more trustworthy behavior on the part of corporate executives. In the long term, all of these aims must be adequately met by an M&E to ensure its survival in a foreign country with stakeholders that have different ethical standards and demands. Next, the M&E should know its impact on the foreign countries it wants to do business in. There are many ways a company can do business abroad, and its success or failure can be strongly affected by the operating environment, including physical, social, and competitive factors. In addition, the M&E's activities can also affect the operating environment, such as through corruption and bribery, environmental impact, and labor policies. According to the eclectic paradigm of international production, there are three conditions that help explain the foreign production decision. First, ownership advantages. Think of these as the unique strengths that multinational enterprises bring to the table, like advanced technology, strong brands, or specialized expertise. These give them an edge over local companies in the host country. Location-specific advantages. These are the reasons why a particular country is an attractive spot for foreign direct investment or FDI. It could be factors like abundant natural resources, skilled labor, or favorable government policies that make the location stand out. Next, internalization advantages. This is all about keeping things in-house, instead of selling or licensing their know-how to others. MNEs decide to use their unique strengths themselves, which often ensures better control and efficiency. But how about the citizens of the foreign countries that are subject to foreign direct investment? Proponents of M&E activities believe these companies bring positive effects to recipient countries. They point to benefits such as increased tax revenues, more jobs, higher export levels, and even greater innovation that could drive development. On the flip side, opponents of foreign direct investment often argue that multinational enterprises contribute to various problems in host countries. They highlight concerns like unfair income distribution, political corruption, damage to the environment, and even social challenges like poverty and inequality. The reality might be somewhere in between, or completely different. Both sides need to present solid evidence to support their claims and address the complexities of the issue. To better visualize, let's say, for example, that a soft drink maker is producing at maximum capacity for the domestic market, but is limited, say, by high transportation costs in generating export sales. In addition, moving into other product lines or using its financial resources to increase domestic productivity aren't viable options. Setting up a foreign production facility is appealing because it would allow the company to develop foreign sales without reducing resource employment in its home market. In fact, it may wind up hiring additional domestic managers to oversee international operations. Perhaps it will also end up earning dividends and royalties from the foreign use of its capital, brand, and technology. In recent years, many US and European garment manufacturers have moved production operations to low-wage countries to realize cost advantages. In the process, they've shut down or at least declined to expand home country operations. Conversely, of course, host countries gain through the transfer of capital and technology. If that capital is used to acquire host country operations that are going out of business, then the foreign investor may very well save host country jobs and, through the import of technology and managerial ability, even create new jobs. Critics, however, claim that FDI destroys local entrepreneurship in ways that affect national development. They contend that MNEs often make investments that domestic companies could otherwise make, thereby locking out local entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs are inspired by the reasonable expectation of success, the collapse in several countries of small cottage industries, especially in the face of M&E efforts to consolidate local operations, may have played a role in undermining the competitive confidence of local business people.
As we all know, ethical behavior is crucial in international business, but the way we determine what is right or wrong can vary greatly depending on cultural context. While some actions are universally agreed upon as right or wrong, others are less clear. In such situations, individuals and companies must navigate moral reasoning to decide what's best. Now, moral development actually plays a major role in how we approach ethical decisions, and there are three main levels of moral development. First up is the pre conventional level. At this stage, people, most especially children, learn what is right or wrong, but they may not necessarily understand why those behaviors are considered as right or wrong. For example, a child might follow rules to avoid punishment, but it does not yet grasp the deeper reasons behind those rules. At the conventional level, however, individuals follow societal norms and rules because they seek to conform to societal expectations or expectations of others. At this level, people often follow societal laws and company codes of conduct simply because it's the norm or because they seek approval from peers and society. Lastly, we have the post-conventional or autonomous or principled level. At this stage, individuals internalize ethical principles. Their behavior aligns with what they believe is morally right rather than out of fear of punishment or the need for approval. This level is actually based on autonomous moral reasoning, wherein people make decisions based on what they truly believe is ethical, even when it may go against the law or societal norms. When confronted with ethical decisions, individuals often engage in moral reasoning using two different approaches. First is the teleological approach. So, this decision making process is actually based on the consequences of an action. And here, utilitarianism is actually a key example, wherein the rightness of an action is determined by its ability to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In contrast, the deontological approach focuses on doing what is morally right regardless of the consequences. People following this approach believe that some actions are inherently right or wrong. For example, a deontologist may argue that lying is wrong even if telling the truth would have negative consequences. Most of the time, individuals may blend both approaches, evaluating both ends, which are the consequences, and the means or the moral duties when making decisions. So you may ask, why do we have to care about ethical behavior and why do companies care about ethical behavior? Well, ethical behavior is not just about moral values, it's also about business strategy, and companies care about this for several reasons. For example, it is to develop competitive advantage and actually to avoid being perceived as irresponsible by the majority of the public. Now, as companies expand globally, understanding the cultural foundations of ethical behavior become crucial. Different cultures perceive ethical behavior in different ways, which brings us to relativism and normativism. So, with relativism, this approach actually accepts that ethical norms vary from culture to culture, and it suggests that in different environments, we must adapt the local customs out of respect. In other words, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. The moral truth that guide us may be shaped by the values of the society that we are in. Example, if a country permits certain business practices that are considered unethical elsewhere, a relativist would argue that a company should respect local norms and adopt them even if they contradict their home country's values. In contrast, normativism asserts that there are universal standards of behavior that should be accepted by everyone, everywhere. Normativism emphasizes that while individuals may adopt different values, there are core ethical principles such as honesty and fairness that transcend cultural differences. A company might choose to adopt universal business practices regardless of where it operates to ensure consistency and adherence to fundamental ethical values regardless of local laws or norms. Many companies, however, adopt a middle ground, accepting universal moral principles but allowing some flexibility for cultural differences. This approach ensures respect for both local customs while maintaining core ethical values. Dealing with ethical dilemmas is often a balancing act between the means and the ends, and companies actually often use legal standards to guide their behavior because of several good reasons. So, first is that the law embodies many of a country's moral principles. This makes it an adequate guide for proper conduct. The law also provides a clearly defined set of rules, and as such, following it at least establishes a good precedent for acceptable behavior. Moreover, the law contains enforceable rules that apply to everyone, and because the law is a consensus or represents a consensus derived from widely shared experience and deliberation, it reflects careful and wide ranging discussions. However, legal justification is more rooted in the teleological approach to moral reasoning and behavior, and according to legal argument, an individual or company can do anything that is not illegal. However, there are also five good reasons why some think this is inadequate. So, first up is some things that are unethical are not illegal. Some forms of interpersonal behavior, for example, can clearly be wrong even if they're not against the law. The law is also slow to develop in emerging areas and it takes time to pass and test laws in the court. Moreover, because laws especially respond to issues that have already surfaced, they cannot always anticipate dilemmas that will arise in the future. Another reason that some cite is that the law is often based on imprecisely defined moral concepts that cannot be separated from the legal concepts they underpin. Moreover, the law often needs to undergo scrutiny by the courts. This is especially true in the case of case law, in which courts create law by establishing precedent. And lastly, the law is not very efficient. Efficiency in this case implies achieving ethical behavior at a very low cost, and it would be impossible to solve every ethical behavioral problem with an applicable law.
Corruption is not just an ethical issue, it is a global epidemic that cripples economies, weakens governments, and breeds inequality. Today, we discuss bribery and corruption in international business. Corruption is the abuse of power or resources for personal gain or unethical purposes. It often involves bribery, fraud, or favoritism, undermining fairness and integrity in institutions and businesses. It also destabilizes politics, deterring investors and harming businesses. Based on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, corruption is common in high conflict regions like Africa. Bribery is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It involves payments or promises to pay cash or anything of value to influence decisions. It is one facet of corruption. The Bribe Payers Index ranks the top 28 economies by their likelihood of bribery in foreign business. A recent survey found companies from Russia, China, Mexico, Indonesia, and the UAE were among the most likely to pay bribes to secure business advantages. But how does bribery impact real world economies? Let's look at a major case that shook Brazil's political and business landscape. Petrobras, Brazil's national oil company, was involved in a $2 billion bribery scheme. High ranking politicians and foreign companies, including Rolls Royce, were implicated. The scandal tarnished reputations and eroded public trust in the government. This scandal is a stark reminder of how corruption can undermine governments and industries, but its impact goes even further. It lowers national growth, increases cost, and erodes trust in institutions. Beyond economics, corruption undermines democracy and the legitimacy of multinational enterprises. The fight against corruption needs global cooperation and strict enforcement. As citizens, we must hold leaders accountable and reject bribery in all forms. Remember, indifference makes us complicit. So, what is being done globally to tackle corruption? So, first, the OECD, ICC, and the United Nations are leading global efforts to reduce bribery. For example, the OECD Anti Bribery Convention criminalizes bribery in 40 countries. However, enforcement remains weak in 29 nations. Corruption cost Europe 120 billion euro per year. With this, the European Union supports anti-corruption measures. The Commission's Anti-Fraud Office conducts affairs related to corruption, and an internal auditing service monitors the Commission's departments. However, anti-corruption efforts vary across member states, highlighting the need for stronger national legislation. The US also takes corruption seriously. The FCPA bans US firms from bribing foreign officials. Facilitating payments to expedite legal transactions are permitted, whereas bribes intended to secure undue influence are strictly prohibited. The US Justice Department also fights global corruption beyond government officials, exposing a $150 million FIFA bribery scandal due to tax evasion and misuse of the US financial system. In response to corporate scandals that rocked the US, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 tightened corporate governance and boosted FCPA enforcement. In the Philippines, initiatives such as the Anti Money Laundering Act and the Philippine Commission on Good Government play vital roles in recovering stolen assets and preventing illicit financial flows. This said, safeguarding financial integrity is a continuous effort, one that shapes a more just and accountable society for generations to come.
Now, let's explore the critical issues of business ethics, sustainability, from environmental concerns to labor conditions. Companies play a vital role in shaping a better world. Let's dive in. So let's clarify what we mean by environment. First, it's the natural environment, where pollution in the air, water, and also global warming is taken into account. So, how is this created? Well, companies' disposal of waste, either through the water from dumping their chemicals or through the air from smoke from factories. It can also come from extracting natural resources like mineral, gas, oil, timber, which can be renewable or non renewable. And now, laws and regulations do exist in keeping up with the environment for companies, but it's still not enough. The EU estimates that over 400,000 Europeans die prematurely just from health related concerns from air pollution. Sustainability means meeting our needs today without compromising the future. And while government policies help, businesses must adopt responsible practices on their own, preferably with little to no government incentive. Though sustainability requires resources, it can be integrated into profitable business models. So now, the Paris Agreement of 2015 was born. It was a successor from the quote unquote failed Kyoto Protocol of 1997, where they did try to reduce emissions but just ended up with withdrawals. This was because in the Kyoto Protocol, countries like India and China were not present. And in the late 2010s or the early 2010s, countries like the US and Canada actually withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. But things were different with the Paris Agreement, since in the Paris Agreement they had over 187 countries who agreed to keep the global temperatures lower. And this finally included India and China, who were not part of the Kyoto Protocol, and was also found to be the countries with the most emissions of pollution. So, in this, they discussed lessening fossil fuels, where they wanted to move away from fossil fuels, which powered gas and electricity, and ended with a call to sustainable energy, either through solar, wind, or other means. Deforestation was also mentioned in the Paris 2015. They talked about it with Indonesia and Brazil facing massive deforestation in their countries at the time. And deforestation contributed to a rise of greenhouse gases. The challenge for now is to get companies to invest in other sustainable resources of energy without the need for government subsidy or government intervention. So now let's move on to ethical dilemmas. So now we move on to the case of multinational enterprises or MNEs. Since there was a problem where labor conditions of foreign workers in their offshore operations or their outsourced supply chains were getting under fire. On one hand, corporations should be responsible for ensuring fair treatment in every country they operate. But some argue that bureaucracy and middle management obscure these violations, making compliance more difficult. So, what drives these companies to be motivated to act ethically? People say it's from their consumers, investors, NGOs, governments, trade unions, and media. So a lot of stakeholders come into play into the ethicality and corporate responsibility of these multinational enterprises. In response to this, the Ethical Trading Initiative gave recommendations to multinational enterprises to ensure ethicality. So, first, employment is freely chosen. Second, freedom of association and right to collective bargaining is respected. So, these are unions. Third, working conditions are safe and hygienic. Fourth, child labor shall not be used, which will be discussed later. Fifth, living wages are paid. Sixth, working hours are not excessive. Seventh, no discrimination is practiced. Eighth, regular employment is provided. And ninth, no harsh or inhumane treatment is allowed. So now we move on to the dilemma of child labor. On one hand, people say that child labor violates human rights since it limits their education, it may cause them possible physical and psychological harm, it has economic consequences for countries who heavily rely on child labor, and it is open to exploitation by their employers. But on the other hand, people say that it is better to be safe than sorry, as for one example in the Indian carpet industry, where they said that children are better suited to perform certain tasks than adults. And in another example, in Bangladesh, where they were pressured to stop using child labor by their suppliers, on around 5,000 to 7,000 young girls went from factory work to prostitution. So people say that it is better to be safe than sorry. On child labor, the International Labor Organization has guidelines on what should child labor be. So currently, 168 million children aged 5 to 17 are illegally working worldwide. So instead of having child labor be rampant, it is better to be regulated as they said. So some guidelines on this are the children must be at least 12 to 14 years old and they're employed in light work that would be not harmful to their physical or psychological health. Their work should be less than 14 hours a week, and that their work doesn't interfere with school. Case in point, what did IKEA do when they were faced with this dilemma? Since they were buying carpets from an Indian supplier who relied heavily on extensive child labor. IKEA tackled two problems at once rather than forcing suppliers to stop exploiting the children. Firstly, they helped working mothers increase their earning power so that they could escape loan sharks. Secondly, they set up bridge schools to enable working children to enter mainstream education in a year after they were doing child labor. So, this tells us that multinational enterprises actually have the power to improve the lives of workers, and that we should hold these MNEs to a higher standard in order to ensure the ethicality and sustainability of our world as a whole. Now, let's move on to the next topic.
In today's business world, companies face increasing pressure to act responsibly. But why does this matter? What happens when companies fail to uphold ethical standards? And how can they ensure ethical behavior? Let's dive in. First, what do we mean by corporate ethics? Simply put, corporate ethics refers to the principles and values that guide how a company makes decisions and conducts its business. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. But why should companies care about ethics in the first place? It is because unethical behavior can have serious consequences, not just for the company, but for its employees, customers, and society as a whole. So, what happens when a company behaves irresponsibly? Let's look at four major consequences: legal sanctions, consumer boycotts, low employee morale, and bad publicity, which may eventually lead to loss of sales. First are legal sanctions. Breaking ethical rules can lead to lawsuits, fines, and even government intervention. Companies that engage in financial fraud, bribery, or false advertising often face serious consequences. One famous example is the RCBC money laundering scandal in 2016. Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, or RCBC, was linked to an 81 million US dollars money laundering case where stolen funds from the Bangladesh Central Bank were processed through its accounts. As a result, RCBC faced a 1 billion peso fine from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or BSP, and several executives were charged with criminal offenses. Second, consumer boycotts. When customers discover that a company engages in unethical practices, they often respond by refusing to support the brand. Many businesses have faced massive backlash, especially those criticized for unfair labor practices. Take the NutriAsia boycott in 2018, for example. The popular food company, known for brands like Datu Puti and UFC, faced a boycott after reports of contractualization, poor working conditions, and violent dispersals against protesting workers. Consumers took to social media, encouraging people to stop buying NutriAsia products as a way to pressure the company into treating its employees more fairly. The backlash forced NutriAsia to publicly address labor concerns, proving just how powerful consumer action can be. Third, low employee morale. Would you want to work for a company that ignores ethics? Employees become demotivated and lose trust when they see their employer engaging in unfair or exploitative behavior. A well known case is the PLDT labor row in 2018. PLDT reportedly terminated the service contracts of 7,000 workers, sparking outrage among employees and labor groups. However, PLDT denied direct responsibility, claiming that the Department of Labor and Employment, or DOLE, had ordered its 38 service contract providers, including call centers and business process outsourcing firms, to cease operations with PLDT. Regardless of who was really responsible, the controversy led to employee frustration, low morale, and protests, showing how unethical decisions can deeply affect the company's workforce. Lastly, bad publicity and loss of sales. In today's digital world, bad news spreads faster than ever. A single unethical app can destroy a company's reputation, causing customers and investors to lose confidence. Take Jollibee's fried towel incident in 2021. A customer in its PGC branch ordered Chicken Joy, but instead of fried chicken, they received a deep fried towel. The incident went viral online, causing a wave of criticism and memes that hurt Jollibee's image. The company had to temporarily close the branch, issue an official apology, and deal with negative publicity that impacted customer trust. Even a well loved brand like Jollibee isn't immune to the consequences of a single quality control failure. Clearly, being unethical isn't worth the risk. But if these are the consequences of irresponsible behavior, what actually motivates companies to act ethically and responsibly? Most companies aren't ethical just because they feel like it. This is where four strong reasons come into play, directly linked to the consequences mentioned earlier. First, avoiding legal trouble. Of course, nobody wants lawsuits or government investigations. Next is keeping customers happy since a bad reputation can drive people away. Third, maintaining employee trust. It is important to bear in mind that workers are more loyal and productive in ethical companies. And lastly, is preventing bad publicity because one scandal would not only seriously harm sales, but can also damage the company's reputation in the long run. Moving on, a corporate code of ethics or code of conduct is a set of rules that guides how a company and its employees should behave. It helps businesses stay responsible no matter where they operate. But having a code of ethics isn't enough. It needs to be well structured and properly enforced. So, what makes a company's code of conduct truly effective? Here are four important characteristics. First and foremost, global policy implementation, from which the rules apply to all employees no matter where they work. This means that it should set clear global policies, wherein no matter where employees are, they must follow the same ethical guidelines. Following this is effective communication. It reaches beyond the employees, wherein the company makes sure that suppliers, partners, and subcontractors also understand the code. Once understood, the company must ensure active enforcement and compliance through training programs and internal audits. Last but not least, it prioritizes reporting and transparency. Companies must share their ethical performance with external stakeholders through reports and social media to maintain trust. But how do we know if a company is truly being transparent? That's where global reporting standards come in. The Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, helps companies report their ethical performance. It encourages businesses to be honest about how they impact the environment, society, and the economy. One of GRI's major contributions is the G4 Sustainability Reporting Guidelines, which help businesses track and share their efforts in being responsible. With tools like GRI, stakeholders can hold companies accountable, ensuring they stick to their commitments. Given everything that was discussed, why does corporate ethics matter? It protects companies from legal trouble, it helps maintain customer trust and loyalty, it keeps employees engaged and motivated, and it safeguards a company's reputation and long term success. At the end of the day, ethical behavior isn't just about avoiding scandals. It is about building a company that people can trust and respect. With a strong code of ethics and proper enforcement, companies can create a culture of integrity that benefits everyone in the long run. And that wraps up our group's discussion. Thank you so much for watching.